Helena Blavatsky, the spiritual mother of modern New Age movements, frantically burns papers in her dimly lit room. It's London, 1885. The Society for Psychical Research is about to expose her as a fraud. Her mystical miracles, nothing but elaborate parlor tricks. Before her, scattered letters reveal correspondences with German race theorists. In her drawer, half-hidden manuscripts describe superior root races and the inevitable extinction of inferior humans. The woman millions would later worship as an enlightened master nervously glances at diagrams linking ancient Aryan wisdom to modern racial hierarchies. The smoke rises as she destroys evidence. This scene isn't in your spiritual bookstore's biography. This is Helena Blavatsky, the charlatan whose fraudulent spiritualism and racial pseudoscience would eventually inspire both hippie crystal healers and Nazi occultists. The image you probably grew up hearing is smooth and tidy. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky appears as a daring traveler, an exotic bridge between East and West. Born in 1831 in a provincial aristocratic household, the sanitized narrative makes her a restless seeker who spent years in hidden monasteries. She returns with secrets and founds the Theosophical Society in 1875, now framed as a noble attempt to study religion comparatively, promote universal brotherhood, and investigate the unexplained. In that classroom-friendly version, Blavatsky spent 7 mysterious years in Tibet under the tutelage of ascended Mahatmas. These masters, her followers said, transmitted ancient wisdom through clairvoyant channels and telepathic letters. Her books Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine are presented as the fruits of that apprenticeship. Dense, poetic, allegedly revelatory texts that introduced karma, reincarnation, and Eastern metaphysics to a Western public hungry for alternatives to Christian orthodoxy. If you've been to a retreat, flipped through a New Age bestseller, or scanned the wall of a spiritual bookshop, you've likely encountered fragments of this story repackaged as inspiration. Documentaries and glossy biographies tighten the story into a powerful image. They show sepia photographs of a stately woman, quote her aphorisms, and edit out the mess. She becomes a proto-feminist, a courageous outsider who defied Victorian respectability. Critics are reduced to caricatures: jealous clergymen, blinkered scientists, the small-minded guardians of an ossified faith. The narrative comforts. Here is a single visionary who broke orthodoxy and opened the West to ancient, liberating wisdom. This version is tidy because it must be tidy. It supplies an origin myth for practices that now sell by the million. Karma, chakras, energy work, these are presented as timeless gifts handed down to an enlightened messenger. In practical terms, that tidy origin story has commercial value. Spiritual entrepreneurs and book publishers profit when a movement claims authentic lineage. Yoga studios, wellness brands, and spiritual festivals all benefit from a founder who looks like a genuine conduit rather than a controversial opportunist. If the origin story is sacred enough, it raises the perceived value of every downstream product: classes, books, crystals, certificates. The official mythology also serves an emotional purpose. It gives seekers a romantic narrative. One woman traveled into the unknown, returned bearing truth, and was persecuted for her clairvoyance. Suffering becomes proof. Opposition becomes a badge of authenticity. Followers learn to interpret criticism as spiritual blindness. That rhetorical move is powerful. It inoculates a community against scrutiny. If you've ever been told that truth must be misunderstood at first, you've seen this psychological maneuver in action. And yet behind the polished voiceover and flattering portraits, there is another image. A woman in a dim room, burning letters. Private correspondence that reads like frustrated bargaining. Contradictory travel stories. Hidden trapdoors. Plagiarized chapters. The official tale doesn't make room for these details. It smooths them away, like a conservator restoring a painting, and painting over the damage instead of explaining it. That smoothing is not accidental. It's editorial. It's political. It chooses which facts to amplify and which to bury. It chooses heroes and erases witnesses. The result is a version of history that feels whole and meaningful, and that performs perfectly for the market that consumes it. So what did people actually see back then? And why does the tidy story survive, even when messy documents and uncomfortable testimonies exist? There are clear beneficiaries of the comfortable myth: the publishers, the society leaders, the spiritual industries. But there's also a psychological beneficiary: the human desire for a single, luminous origin. We prefer neat founding fathers and mothers. We prefer founders who prove that our path is old, tested, and sanctioned. Before we look at the evidence that begins to unravel this narrative, a short note. Thank you for watching this investigation so far. This channel is new, and every subscription helps us keep digging into histories that mainstream textbooks tidy up. If you believe stories like this should be examined, hit subscribe. Help us reach 1,000 so these investigations can grow. Your voice matters. Your curiosity funds the next unwrapped myth. The neat story is comforting, but comfort is not proof. Turn the page with us. The first cracks appear faster and weirder than you might expect. The first cracks are small at first: a slip of a timeline, a borrowed paragraph, a dismissed witness. Alone, they look like human error. Together, they form a fracture. We begin with phenomena, the theatrical displays Blavatsky used to hold court. Contemporary witnesses described seances where bells rang and letters appeared. Devotees claimed supernatural communications from Tibetan Mahatmas. But these performances were not always witnessed by neutral observers. When skeptical investigators were allowed in, things changed. In 1884, Richard Hodgson, representing the Society for Psychical Research in London, conducted a detailed inquiry. His report was not a sidebar, it was a forensic document. Hodgson and his team catalogued multiple instances where what had been presented as otherworldly could be explained by simple, cunning trickery. One striking detail reads like a stage play blueprint. Hodgson reported sliding panels in Blavatsky's meditation room. He described trapdoors, pre-prepared notes, and accomplices who timed their interventions with practiced precision. He did not accuse the mystical of misunderstanding. He documented physical mechanisms. In one testimony, an observer watched a bell ring though no one touched it until Hodgson found the wire. In another, a sealed letter allegedly appearing from thin air later matched a letter in a drawer, folded and hidden. These are not ambiguous hues of spiritual experience. They are tactile, mechanical actions. That same period also saw the unraveling of Blavatsky's travel mythology. The celebrated 7-year stay in Tibet, the moment the idea of Mahatmas becomes plausible to followers, was supposed to be a cornerstone. On paper, it is cinematic, a daring Western woman studies in isolation with secret masters. In practice, it doesn't hold up. In the late 19th century, Tibet was effectively closed to foreigners. Borders were guarded. Western explorers who did reach the region did so under great difficulty, and this happened primarily in the early 20th century. No reliable records place Blavatsky in Lhasa, in the monasteries, or in sustained contact with recognized Tibetan teachers during the years she claimed. Where official biographies offer vagueness, scrutiny finds contradiction. Blavatsky's travel accounts vary by telling. Details shift between retellings. Routes that would have required weeks of Himalayan crossing become brief anecdotes. When historians press for documentation, ship logs, letters from Tibetan lamas, independent witnesses, the trail grows thin. That thinness is not proof of deceit by itself, but it makes the extravagant claim of Tibetan instruction extraordinarily unlikely. Plagiarism is the next blunt instrument of evidence. The Secret Doctrine, the magnum opus published in 1888, is presented by devotees as a revelation unrecorded before. But meticulous comparison by critics, including a careful follower named William Coleman. Multiple contemporary and later accounts show a woman possessed by intellectual curiosity. She read obsessively, compiled comparative religion notes, and synthesized a sprawling system. That intellectual labor is a fact. The problem is the mix, genuine scholarship and theatrical fraud braided together. That mixture is dangerous. It lends credibility to ideas propped up by performance and lends performance the aura of philosophic depth. Another layer emerges in her private correspondence and friendships. Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, co-founder of the Theosophical Society, presented the public face of rational defense. Privately, Olcott recorded doubts. He worried publicly about credibility but feared destroying the movement they'd built. The push-pull between protecting a social project and confronting its founders' possible deceptions is human and revealing. It shows how movements can self-protect by closing ranks. They substitute institutional survival for the messy work of verification. Critics at the time saw something else, a pattern of opportunism. Blavatsky had tried several ventures, some successful, many not. She had worked as a medium, attempted entrepreneurial projects, and pursued attention through salons and public speaking. For a charismatic person with few stable financial prospects, a spiritual movement offered both respectability and revenue. That motive alone doesn't explain the frauds. Religious innovators are often motivated by conviction and survival at once. But motives shape choices. When the pressure to sustain an organization or to validate an identity is high, so is the temptation to manufacture evidence. Historians disagree over how to weigh these elements. Some have argued Hodgson's report was overly zealous, tainted by bias against spiritual pluralism. Later scholars have revisited the primary documents and suggested that while certain phenomena were surely staged, other elements of Blavatsky's thought draw legitimately from comparative study and might contain intellectual value separate from the theatrics. This is an important caveat. Not every strange claim from a complex thinker is necessarily a deliberate lie. There is a spectrum from sincere eccentricity to cynical manipulation, and Blavatsky occupies a contested place on it. But the pattern matters. Multiple independent issues, mechanical trickery in seances, implausible Tibet narratives, extensive plagiarism, insider letters describing staged phenomena, and abrupt flights do not sum to minor eccentricities. They form a consistent, escalating set of contradictions that hit the core of the movement's claim to ancient legitimacy. The social consequence is striking. Theosophy did not vanish when these cracks appeared. It adapted. Many followers recalibrated. Some reinterpreted the Mahatmas as symbolic. Others doubled down on faith, invoking persecution narratives. Leaders like Annie Besant later sanitized Blavatsky's image, emphasizing the inspiring parts and downplaying the ugly. The movement moved from scandal to myth. What does this first set of fractures leave us with? A founder whose public genius cannot be separated cleanly from private deception. A community willing in many cases actively to bury inconvenient facts to preserve identity. And a broader pattern. How the hunger for ancient origin stories can make audiences forgiving of evidence that would otherwise be disqualifying. These are not mere technicalities. They are the tracks on which the later and darker uses of Blavatsky's ideas would run. The question that opens from here is no longer whether she faked seances or lied about travel. The deeper question is about the ideas she clothed in theatrical authority, ideas about human hierarchy, evolution, and race, and who else would read those ideas as permission to act in the world. The next movement in this story makes that danger painfully visible. Behind the theatrical stage of seances and the sepia portraits, Helena Blavatsky's life looked less like a mountaintop vision and more like a cramped backstage of a traveling troupe. The rooms where she wrote and received visitors were not sanctuaries, but busy workshops. Papers, unopened letters, smoking ashes, and the constant tangle of people who kept the show alive. You can almost hear the low murmur of conversation strategies being hatched, alibis polished, envelopes passed beneath the table. Those closest to her remembered small, human details that never made it into hagiographies. She smoked incessantly. The cigarette smoke clung to her hair and to the upholstery. She coughed through long winters and complained about achy limbs. She swore when visitors were late. She once snapped at an assistant for bringing the wrong ink and sent the woman away in tears. These are the scraps of life historians find in private letters and diaries, moments that undercut the aura of serene, otherworldly composure the public image depends on. But the daily mess also shows procedures. The rituals that mystified audiences had, in private, a script. Preparations for phenomena followed routines. Objects hidden in cushions, notes placed behind paneling, signals rehearsed by an inner circle. Emma Coulomb's letters kept and later published read like a stage cue sheet. They describe folding papers precisely, the placement of bells, the timing for assistants to enter and exit. When you read them, the séance ceases to be an altar and becomes a stage set. This is not speculation. These are rings of ink on paper, handwriting matched to known assistants. The house itself becomes evidence. Yet Helena was not only a manager of tricks. She was an industrious reader and compiler. Her notebooks overflowed with quotations from Sanskrit dictionaries, Christian mystics, Neoplatonists, and the latest works of comparative religion. She annotated everything, sometimes angrily. In those margins you can trace a mind assembling a system. She could summon erudition on command. That side of her, the scholar, was earnest and painstaking. It explains why some of her ideas stuck. They were scaffolded on real reading and a mind that could synthesize. This combination, showmanship and scholarship, created a potent charisma. Supporters felt not only dazzled but intellectually persuaded. They left performances convinced they had witnessed more than magic. They had encountered an interpretive framework that explained the universe. It's easy to see how a cultured crowd, hungry for meaning in a rapidly changing world, would embrace such a hybrid. When someone provides spectacle and theory together, it feels like proof. The visual confirms the bookish insight. Still, not everyone around her believed in the miracle. Alcott, the public face who shared her podium, is a study in contradiction. In public, he defended Blavatsky with a steady, rational voice, presenting their work as a modern pursuit of religious truth. In private, he recorded doubts and anxieties. He worried about credibility. He worried about money. He worried that a single scandal could topple the fragile structure they had built. Imagine him in a small study, shoulders hunched, reading a letter about a suspicious incident and wondering which narrative to prop up. His choice was institutional survival. That choice reveals something critical. Movements sometimes protect themselves by protecting their founders. The network around Blavatsky was not accidental. It was strategic. There were devotees who believed with a kind of devotional hunger. There were opportunists who saw status or profit. There were colonial officers who liked having an expert who could provide spiritual rationales for their actions. In India, Blavatsky cultivated relationships with British officers and local elites who enjoyed the exotic prestige she conferred. These alliances were transactional, access to certain circles in exchange for patronage, introductions, and local protection. Theosophy thus became embedded in a social web that stretched from drawing rooms in London to clubs in Bombay. That web extended into more troubling political currents. Blavatsky's language and metaphors about stages of human evolution and root races resonated with prevailing scientific prejudices. In letters and private exchanges, she flirted with ideas that circulated among German naturalists and nationalist thinkers who were exploring racial hierarchies. Some of those correspondence were casual, a shared article, a debate in print, others more engaged. The correspondence reads like intellectual barter, a feed of ideas where mystical vocabulary and racial theory cross-pollinated. At the time, racial science claimed legitimacy, Esoteric language offered a metaphysical gloss. When these ideas were translated outward into the pamphlets, when scandal peaked in India, she left abruptly for parts unknown, appearing months later under a different story. Travel accounts vary, dates wobble. That variability is not just a sloppy memoir. It's a pattern that emerges whenever performance and persona are being protected. When narrative coherence threatens an institution, stories bend. The gaps in Blavatsky's travel record are not neutral. They are potential seams where invention filled in silence. And yet, her followers didn't desert her wholesale. Some recalibrated. They reinterpreted her errors as tests or as the price of persecution. They saw the Hodgson report as biased, as proof that the enlightened are always misread. This psychological maneuver, turning accusation into martyrdom, keeps movements intact. It's simple and powerful. If truth results in persecution, then persecution proves truth. Once you accept that logic, you make contradictory evidence irrelevant. You should be asking, how much of the movement's durability was due to belief and how much to savvy organization? The answer is both. Theosophy had rituals that created belonging and an apparatus that managed narratives. It had rhetoric that appealed to conscience and rhetoric that appealed to vanity. It had a leader who manufactured awe and a coterie that managed the optics. When spectacle and bureaucracy meet, the result is difficult to dismantle and even harder to unlearn. The backstage reveals a woman who was at once brilliant and compromised, a thinker who plagiarized, a showwoman who organized deception, and a strategist who cultivated political ties. Her life was messy in human terms, and that mess fed the movement in ways hagiographies never explain. But those same messy choices seeded the ideological dangers that would sprout after her death. The machine she helped start required not only her charisma, but also a set of ideas that others would one day weaponize. The question now is not only who Helena was, but how what she created could be repurposed. And the answer begins with the single document she left as a public legacy, a book that claimed to explain humanity itself. What followed when that book was unleashed would change how ideas about race traveled through both spiritual circles and the violent politics of a new century. The next stage reveals how an esoteric theory became a doctrine with real, harmful consequences. The secret doctrine arrived like a cathedral of words. Thick, dense, ornate, its physical presence announced seriousness. It was presented not as a pamphlet, but as a system. Cosmogony, anthropology, metaphysics stitched into one gigantic argument. For admirers, this was the culmination of Helena's life's work, proof that ancient wisdom existed and that she had accessed it. For critics, it was a tower of citations and borrowings that masked ideological commitments. Inside its pages appeared the model that would be most consequential, the 7 root races. This was not a casual metaphor. It was a comprehensive taxonomy of humanity that assigned spiritual capacities along lines that looked suspiciously like skin color, geography, and cultural status. The 5th root, identified with Aryan peoples, was described as the current pinnacle of human development. Earlier and later roots were framed as superior or degenerate in relation to that imagined axis. The language was metaphysical, but the implications were material. Here was a spiritual cosmology that provided a moral and cosmic justification for hierarchy. It claimed ancestry as destiny. It mapped difference to evolution. It suggested that some peoples were nearer to a divine unfolding while others remained as vestiges of earlier, decaying forms. Read in a climate already saturated with scientific racism, these claims did not float in a vacuum. They landed and embedded. The immediate reaction was complex. Within theosophical circles, the book was devoured. Branches across Europe, South Asia, North America distributed it. Meetings turned into debates. Some leaders insisted on literal readings. Others attempted symbolic or allegorical interpretations. The text's sheer loftiness allowed interpretive wiggle room. It could be read as parable or as natural law. That ambiguity was powerful. Communities seeking spiritual legitimacy could choose the reading that best suited their sympathies. Beyond the society, the book traveled to audiences primed to hear it as confirmation. Think of an intellectual climate where race was being discussed in parlors, in universities, in colonial offices. Social Darwinism supplied the lab coat. Theosophy supplied the halo. Blavatsky's synthesis provided a metaphysical imprimatur to notions that were already gaining traction. When a theory cloaks itself in ancient authority, its appeal multiplies. That is how spiritual rhetoric becomes policy-friendly. The chain from esoteric idea to political program is not immediate nor linear. It is a series of translations. You can trace that chain through magazines, through small printed lectures, through the hobbyist occult groups that read and republished parts of the secret doctrine. Texts were excerpted, images reproduced, phrases turned into handbills. In Germany, in the early years of the 20th century, nationalist groups and folkish circles found in the root race narrative a satisfying mythic prehistory. It gave an ancient origin to modern claims of belonging and superiority. Organizations such as the Thule Society and other proto-fascist groups were not, in most cases, direct followers of theosophy, but they borrowed comfortably. Theosophical vocabulary, archaic races, lost continents. Aryan symbolism slid into the rhetoric of nationalist mysticism. Think of a meeting of ideologues flipping through occult pamphlets and deciding that spiritual genealogy confirms political destiny. Heinrich Himmler's interest in esoterica is well documented. He amassed books and symbols, created rituals, and infused aspects of Nazi ideology with a pseudo-mythic flavor. To say Blavatsky caused Nazism would be false. But to say that segments of her imagery found an audience among those who wanted mystical validation for racial policy is not only plausible, it's documented. There were other, quieter consequences. In colonies where theosophy operated, the doctrine offered colonizers a spiritual rationale to minimize or dismiss indigenous claims. If certain peoples were framed as an earlier root, as dying out, or less spiritually evolved, colonial rule could be recast as a civilizational stewardship. The language of progress and decline melted into moral cosmology. This was not just theory on paper. It affected how administrators and missionaries perceived conquered peoples. Policies about education, about governance, about improvement were influenced by ideologies that looked less silly when wrapped in metaphysical phrases. The book also affected the movement's internal culture. Theosophical branches began to attract actors who wanted spiritual authority but also social prestige. Academics, aristocrats, occultists, and curious socialites rubbed shoulders. Some used theosophy to advance political aims. Others sought to be close to the ancient wisdom for personal elevation. The movement's expanding social footprint meant its ideas filtered outward into artifacts of modern life. Lectures, school curricula in places where the society had influence, periodicals circulated among elites. There were immediate, practical effects for Blavatsky's reputation too. For partisans, the text was scripture. For skeptics, it was a target. The Hodgson report, already damning about her phenomena, gained rhetorical force against the doctrine's claims. Critics cataloged plagiarisms and inconsistencies. Scholars and journalists pointed out verbatim borrowings from 19th century texts. The revelation that whole sections had close parallels to existing sources challenged the argument of revelation. When a supposed source of ancient wisdom shows up as a collage of contemporary writings, the foundation cracks. Yet influence is not reduced solely to textual purity. A book's practical power often lies in how others use it. The secret doctrine functioned as a reservoir of images and phrases hungry movements could pump from. In a Europe hurtling toward tragedies born of racial doctrine, having an occult genealogy was a rhetorical weapon. It permitted people to claim transcendence while practicing exclusion. It gave cosmic scale to political contempt. At the same time, many inside Theosophy attempted to distance themselves from. After the secret doctrine, the movement was no longer merely a circle of eccentrics. It was now an influential transmitter, a cultural node through which metaphysical ideas could leak into mainstream ideologies. The book's pages carried more than esoteric cosmology. They carried a language that, in the wrong hands and the wrong political climates, lent spiritual authority to hierarchies that would later be used as justification for violence. The result is a moral ambivalence that still matters. When spiritual systems claim ancient sanction for social hierarchies, the cost is the normalization of human difference. And normalization makes atrocity easier to conceive. That is why a thick, ornate book from 1888 still matters, because its vocabulary traveled and found an audience that turned metaphysical speculation into political fate. The next act in this story is not simply about text. It is about how that text was turned into memory. How, after Blavatsky's death, a determined campaign rebranded her as a saintly origin for popular spiritual currents. That rehabilitation is a story of editing, selection, and cultural marketing, and it explains why so many today encounter her ideas without seeing their darker genealogy. When Helena Blavatsky died in 1891, she left a complicated legacy: followers, detractors, a corpus of writings, and a reputation shredded in some quarters and adored in others. The immediate task facing her movement's leaders was survival. Annie Besant stepped into that vacuum with a clear instinct: narratives matter. She set about retelling Blavatsky's story in ways that would secure institutional continuity. What followed was not merely biography. It was a program of image manufacture. The first instrument was publication. The Theosophical Press became an engine of rehabilitation. Editions of Blavatsky's works were reprinted with careful introductions and selective footnotes. Controversial passages were minimized. Pages that accused her of fraud received defensive commentary. Besant and her allies curated collections of testimonies, letters, and recollections that portrayed Blavatsky as persecuted genius. A biography produced under theosophical auspices functioned less as history than as an apologetic. Its aim was to sanctify, to provide a clear, sympathetic narrative arc. It succeeded because it offered coherence where scandal had produced chaos. Visual culture was equally important. Photography and portraiture were harnessed to create an icon. Harsh, humanizing images were replaced by dignified, composed photographs that emphasized a penetrating gaze, a composed posture. The cigarette, the no-nonsense temper, the messy room all vanished in favor of an image that could be framed and hung in meeting halls. Visual editing is deceptively powerful. An image repeated in many spaces becomes, by familiarity, a kind of truth. Then came systematic censorship of inconvenient material within theosophical channels. Journals and lecture series under society control were used to drown critical voices. Dissenters' letters were dismissed. Contrarian reports were framed as malicious gossip. When external investigators published damning findings like Hodgson's report, society publications often questioned the investigators' motives rather than addressing the facts. Attacking the messenger can be an effective strategy when the goal is to preserve a myth. Marketing followed. Theosophical centers packaged teachings in palatable forms. Lecture series presented karma and reincarnation stripped of their more disturbing racial scaffolding. Popular pamphlets offered digestible spiritual exercises. Societies promoted events that emphasized universal brotherhood. The darker edges of Blavatsky's doctrine were reinterpreted as symbolic or allegorical. This semantic sleight of hand shifted the public focus from specific claims about race to lofty moral principles. Why would this sanitization work so well? Because it met a real cultural demand. At the turn of the century, many in the West wanted spiritual alternatives that did not demand institutional submission to Christianity. Theosophy offered spiritual novelty with an air of respectability. Besant and others amplified the respectable pieces and muted the scandalous ones. That made Blavatsky's work marketable to the growing middle-class appetite for alternative spirituality. The production of secondary literature was crucial. Hagiographies, edited letters, and retellings proliferated. Each new book or article repeated the selectively curated narrative. The repetition made a myth. Over time, the sanitized story acquired its own momentum. It was quoted in lectures, used in schoolrooms associated with the movement, and reprinted in allied periodicals. People who had never read the original text encountered a softened version and assumed it to be the whole truth. The arc continued into the 20th century with the rise of the New Age. As healing, meditation, and Eastern spiritual practices entered Western markets, Blavatsky's image was again recruited, now as a brand asset. Publishers and practitioners plucked aphorisms from her work, quotes about karma, about ancient masters, and dropped them into self-help manuals and workshop scripts. The dense metaphysical scaffolding was simplified into convenient, feel-good snippets. In the process, the problematic elements were edited out, explained away as products of their time, or reassigned to allegory. This is cultural laundering at scale. Complex, contradictory texts were transmuted into digestible spiritual commodities. Overnight, centuries of context were replaced by a handful of uplifting phrases. Yoga studios and wellness columns taught energy and vibrations, terms that came via theosophical reframing, without tracing them back to origins that included racialized metaphors. New cultural consumers drank the spiritual cocktail, but rarely read the recipe. There were institutions that actively participated in this reworking. Publishing houses with commercial stakes in esoterica had an interest in promoting benign, teachable content. Theosophical centers had an institutional interest in growth. Academics and popularizers sometimes preferred an inspiring founder story for didactic purposes. The confluence of market imperatives, institutional survival, and popular appetite produced a sanitized narrative nearly impenetrable to casual readers. But sanitization was not achieved by omission alone. It was also achieved by reinterpretation. Leaders like Besant did not always deny problematic passages. Instead, they offered alternative hermeneutics. Racist-sounding passages were reframed as metaphors for spiritual stages. Plagiarism was repositioned as synthesis or as an occult method of presenting perennial truths. This rhetorical strategy is subtle. It preserves the useful core while mitigating reputational damage. It also creates plausible deniability. Critics could be informed they were missing metaphysical nuance and accusation that tends to silence debates rather than solve them. The result of all this was generational. Younger followers grew up reading edited collections and attending centers where Blavatsky's image was benign. Over decades, the story ossified. New Age authors and teachers, decades removed from the original controversies, treated Blavatsky as a kindly pioneer. The deeper, uncomfortable elements remained buried in archives and specialist scholarship. Most practitioners and consumers never went digging. This is why the contemporary marketplace carries the residue of Blavatsky without its original context. A yoga class teaching chakras, a best-selling book on raising your vibration, a meditation app invoking ascended masters. These are products of a long chain of transmission in which initial controversy was systematically domesticated. The high irony is that practices now marketed as secular wellness often owe their phrasing to a movement whose founder trafficked in obfuscation and elitist hierarchies. Who benefited from this rebranding? Many did. The Theosophical Society survived and extended its reach. Publishers sold books. Teachers gained audiences. The wellness industry gained backstory. Nations and institutions found useful cultural materials to appropriate. In short, both spiritual seekers and commercial actors found something to gain by forgetting a founder's darker corners. That forgetting is not inevitable, it is manufactured. It requires choices, to reframe, to edit, We must look at the press that printed the sanitized biography, at the board that decided which letters to publish and which to bury, and at the markets that found a profit in a palatable founder. The next step is to assemble a more honest portrait, to look at evidence and intent, to weigh influence against responsibility, and to ask whether cultural memory has been allowed to whitewash historical wrongs. If the machine made a saint, who made the saint, and who gains from her sainthood? That is where serious investigation must go next, into the choices made after death and their continuing consequences. A more honest portrait of Helena Blavatsky refuses easy labels. She was not a saint dressed in mystic robes, nor was she a one-note charlatan pulled from a cautionary pamphlet. She was a practitioner of power, intellectual, theatrical, and political, who mixed serious scholarship with spectacular deception. Seen close up, her life looks like an economy of influence. Texts, performances, allies, and a steady willingness to bend the truth when the price of credibility rose. Picture her in a cramped study, books piled to the ceiling, marginalia scrawled in 3 languages. The image most New Age biographies omit is not the cigarette or the temper, but the obsessive librarian. She read widely and fast. Sanskrit fragments, 19th century natural history, weave of occultism and comparative religion, all of these fed the machinery she designed. In other words, much of what made theosophy influential came from genuine intellectual synthesis. That's the inconvenient first truth. She did, in places, create something new, a Western grammar for talking about karma, reincarnation, and Eastern metaphors. Those phrases would travel far beyond her salons. But synthesis is not the same as sanctity. The rituals and phenomena that announced her authority were, overwhelmingly, theatrical tricks borrowed from the spiritualist circuit. Letters from Mahatmas, sudden knocks in sealed rooms, objects appearing in supposed trance. These were techniques anyone who watched Victorian seances would recognize. Contemporary investigators documented sliding panels, Confederates in the wings, and pre-arranged messages. Those are not mere stylistic choices. They are methods to convert wonder into consent. You don't need to be evil to use them. You only need a stakes-driven purpose. Survival of an idea, protection of an institution, cultivation of a following. This brings us to the darkest seam in her work, race. Her metaphysics contained an elaborate racial cosmology, the 7 root races that read like a spiritual taxonomy with real-world consequences. Here the synthesis becomes poisonous. When spiritual hierarchy borrows the language of biological development, it ceases to be metaphor and becomes license. Blavatsky's descriptions of declining races, of Aryan primacy, did not exist in a vacuum. They fit neatly into a culture already steeped in scientific racism and imperialism. Presenting hierarchy as cosmic law gave certain readers permission to extend metaphysical contempt into social policy. That is the critical difference between an odd theological theory and a dangerous political tool. Her motives were not monolithic. In private letters and in the patterns of her life, ambition and insecurity sit side by side with genuine curiosity. She wanted status. She also wanted to break theological monopolies. She courted patrons, cultivated aristocrats, and made common cause with reformers who could give her ideas reach. Simultaneously, she cultivated fringe alliances, racially minded nationalists in Europe, colonial officials in India who found her distinctions useful, occultists who wanted mythic genealogies for their politics. These alliances show how ideas are transactional. Theosophy thrived because it offered symbolic capital to different buyers: religious dissenters, cultural romantics, and political nationalists. Each took what was useful and discarded what was inconvenient. There is also the instrumental use of texts. Portions of the secret doctrine were lifted from contemporary sources, sometimes verbatim, and repurposed as ancient wisdom. Plagiarism here operated as a theatrical device. If a passage read erudite and obscure, it could be framed as recovered truth. When exposed, such borrowings were reinterpreted as synthesis, providential coincidence, or the occult method of presenting perennial truths. These evasions are telling. They reveal a pattern. When evidence could shore up authority, it was cited. When it threatened authority, it was reframed or buried. So how do we hold these pieces together? The honest portrait is ambivalent. Blavatsky is a pioneer of a certain kind of religious pluralism, bringing Eastern terms into Western discourse, but also an architect of dangerous symbolic hierarchies. She manufactured phenomena to win believers. She trafficked in racial ideas that lent spiritual gloss to exclusion. She was creative and calculating, visionary and opportunistic. This ambivalence explains her endurance. Her innovations were useful, her deceptions forgivable or invisible to many, and her racist doctrines easily shelved when markets or morals demanded it. None of this absolves later abuses. Intent matters less than effect when vast movements repurpose theories into policy. Blavatsky may have been a spiritual entrepreneur who sought influence more than empire, but the toolkit she assembled, mythic prehistory, staged authority, and metaphysical hierarchy, became available to actors whose ambitions had far darker ends. That availability is part of her legacy. The previous scene's books, rooms, alliances led straight to choices made by other hands, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. And that is the thread we follow next, into the world that inherited her language. Mini cliffhanger. The portrait is unsettling because it is incomplete unless we trace the fingerprints forward, how a founder's language becomes someone else's manifesto. The next act shows where those fingerprints landed. Blavatsky's fingerprints are everywhere you don't expect to see them. Walk into a modern yoga studio and listen. Teachers speak of chakras, energy, and raising vibration. The terms feel contemporary, therapeutic, sometimes secular. Few students realize those words passed through theosophical filters on their way west. Theosophy repackaged and translated complex South Asian practices into a vocabulary that suited Western imaginations, simplified, decontextualized, and primed for mass consumption. That transformation was not neutral. It made exoticism legible and saleable. Imagine two quick scenes. First, a sunny studio where 30 people follow a class called Balanced Chakras. Smooth music, candles, a smiling instructor borrowing a line from a 19th century esoteric glossary. Second, a dim archive room, a ledger open to a page of theosophical notes on chakras, dense, syncretic, and freighted with metaphysical hierarchy. The distance between those images is the path of cultural laundering. Concepts once embedded in particular traditions became generic tools for self-improvement. The market rewarded clarity and accessibility. Nuance was taxed and lost. The commercial side is striking. Spirituality migrated into commerce. Pamphlets became books, then workshops, then brands. Publishers found authors. Teachers found audiences. Yoga studios became franchises. The language that once justified cosmic hierarchies now sells wellness retreats. That irony should make the floor feel unsteady. The same vocabulary used to argue for racial destiny now trades on inclusivity in Instagram posts. The mismatch is not merely semantic. It reflects the power of repetition and selection. Repetition sanitizes. Selection favors what sells. The result is a popular spiritual marketplace that owes far more to organizational marketing than to unbroken tradition. Beyond wellness, Blavatsky's racial metaphors found fertile ground in ideologies that wanted mythic authority. Early 20th century Germany is the obvious and chilling chapter. Folkish societies, proto-Nazi groups like the Thule Society, and later SS ideologues sought narratives that made nationhood cosmic. Theosophical talk of Aryan origins and ancient wisdom supplied a convenient mythology. Figures like Heinrich Himmler collected occult texts alongside racial treatises. He sought rights that a meditation app invites you to align with higher masters. A best-selling author uses the phrase, "raise your vibration," as if it were neutral. Museums exhibit ornate Eastern artifacts without explaining the detour those artifacts took through European esotericism. Educators teach simplified chakras, while the archive holds complicated texts that question origins and intent. The effect is a cultural amnesia. The public inherits a language, but not its entanglements. There are important resistances. Scholars, activists, and practitioners from South Asia have long contested theosophical appropriations. Several contemporary theosophical groups have officially repudiated racist passages. Yoga traditions have movements toward decolonizing practice, reclaiming context, credit, and ritual integrity. These corrections matter. They are the countercurrent to the laundering process. Yet the mass market moves faster than nuance, and commercialization rewards catchy phrases over careful history. So what does the present look like in practice? It looks like a dozen intersecting scenes. A mindfulness course borrowing theosophical phrasing. A far-right group recycling occult motifs to justify exclusion. A museum tag that omits a colonial chain of custody. A best-selling self-help book quoting an aphorism detached from its charged origin. Those scenes add up. They form a network of influence that is part history, part marketing, and part political hazard. Mini cliffhanger. The uncomfortable reality is that familiarity doesn't equal innocence. If a word can be used to heal, it can also be used to harm. The final question is not only about Blavatsky. It is about how we decide which parts of a legacy to keep and which to interrogate, and who gets to decide. We began with flame and paper, a founder burning evidence in a cramped London room. We moved through the pretty story everyone sells: mystic pilgrim, feminist icon, spiritual pioneer, and watched that tidy tail buckle under the weight of sliding panels, contradicted travels, and wholesale borrowings. We met the backstage life. Ambition, calculation, alliances. We watched the central event, the secret doctrine, roll out a racial cosmology that could be, and was, harvested by others. We followed the propaganda machine that turned scandal into sanctity. Finally, we traced the residue of those choices into today's wellness apps, nationalist myths, and contested museum displays. Put plainly, a lot of what you call spiritual vocabulary arrived with baggage. Now the question we leave you with is simple and sharp. When a tradition or teacher offers words that comfort, how much of the origin story are you willing to ignore to keep the comfort? That single choice, what to learn and what to forget, shapes public memory and political possibility. It decides whether language becomes medicine or rationale. If you've stayed with this investigation, thank you. If this video changed how you hear certain words in studios, apps, or politics, tell us where you heard them: city, country, the setting. Subscribe to follow more open files like this one. Each new subscriber helps sustain investigations that schools and markets rarely fund. Comment below with a story of a teacher or idea you once trusted and what you learned when you looked behind the curtain. Mini cliffhanger for the series. Helena Blavatsky is one file in a wider archive. If one founding myth can be pried apart, how many others, comfortably taught and marketable, will look very different under the bright light of records and testimony? There are more dossiers waiting to be opened, and that is what this channel aims to do.